CDP Hong Kong, WWF Singapore, World Resources Institute Indonesia, and the UN Global Compact local charters of Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Just a quick reminder that we will be recording this session. Between October and November, the founding members of SBTi will be bringing together financial institutions and companies to discuss the business case and the technical aspects of setting science-based targets, or SBTs. We will also have a session on information exchange from companies that have committed and validated their targets in line with the Paris Agreement. And then we will also be providing a guidance that has been recently developed for a decarbonization pathway for the financial sector. For today, we have a fairly packed session ahead of us, and I very much appreciate the support of our speakers and panelists who will be providing their insights on the business applications of setting science-based targets. Before we commence the session, I would also like to thank CDP's outreach partners in the region, specifically TGO, which is a national government entity established for effective greenhouse gas management in Thailand, and the Business Environment Council Hong Kong, which is an organization that has been working with companies and policy on environmental and social best practices since 1992. And also, I would like to appreciate the support of our accredited solutions providers who have been working with companies in the region in developing decarbonization pathways. Before we jump into SBTs, I've put together a few data points that CDP has gathered from over 2,500 companies in Asia Pacific. As you see on this slide, 2/3 of the companies that reported to us in 2019 identified physical or transition risks related to climate change. The data also matches the surveys that were conducted by the World Economic Forum and Alliance that shows natural catastrophes are the greatest concern for businesses in East Asia and Pacific. CDP also asks companies on how they see climate risks impacting their business across the various categories that you see on this slide. The two red bars on this chart show the number of companies that have reported climate risks already impacting their businesses across research and development, products and services, and supply chains. CDP also gathers data on how climate risks and low carbon opportunities feature within a company's financial planning. Among the companies in Asia Pacific, the greatest financial impact that companies are already reporting on is within operating costs and revenue streams. Approximately 70% of the 2,500 companies that reported to us last year also already have emission targets or are intending to set one within the next 2 years. 20% of these companies reported on setting both absolute and intensity-based targets. And around 264 companies in Asia Pacific today have joined the Science Based Targets initiative and have committed to setting reduction targets in line with what the latest science is saying, which is needed to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Approximately half of these companies have validated their targets to the Science Based Targets initiative. In August and September of 2020, CDP also launched an investor campaign where we asked companies to align their business models to the Paris Agreement. 137 investors globally endorsed CDP's campaign, asking companies worldwide to commit to setting science-based targets. Over 600 of these companies are based in Asia. My colleague Alberto will walk us through an introduction on science-based targets and what that entails. But before that, we wanted to set forth a quick polling session, and we'd very much appreciate your participation in these polls. The first question is your company's climate strategy integrated with overall enterprise risk management? Second is, has your company conducted a financial impact analysis of climate change on your business? And the third is, has your company identified low carbon opportunities within product and service portfolios? We will be discussing the survey results in our panel session later, so please do give us your inputs. This polling session will be available over the next 5 minutes. I'll now hand it over to Alberto to walk us through the rest of the session.
Thank you very much, Pratima. Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time, and thanks to the organizer for the invitation to speak at this event. I will give a brief overview about science-based targets and the Science-Based Targets Initiative. To start with, as Pratima mentioned, we have clear goals at the global level agreed 5 years ago. In a couple of months, we're going to be celebrating the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And through the Paris Agreement, virtually every nation on the planet agreed to limit global warming and to aim to keep warming well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And basically, to meet these goals, we know that we need to substantially reduce emissions over the next decade, and we need to phase out carbon emissions from our economy by mid-century, so in 3 decades from now. And although this is an agreement that was signed by countries, we know that in order to achieve this goal, the role of the private sector, business sector is critical. And so acknowledging this gap and also the challenge of transforming our economy towards a zero carbon economy, the Science-Based Targets Initiative was set up 5 years ago with the idea of driving the adoption of targets in the corporate sector that are consistent with this goal. Now, as I briefly mentioned, basically for us to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees, the transformation that we need to undergo is very clear. We need to move from our current economic model where we are releasing over 50 gigatons of emissions every year to satisfy the needs of the population towards an economic system that can deliver the same quality of life without putting carbon in the atmosphere. And we need to do this transition in the next 3 decades if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, or maximum 5 decades if we want to limit warming to well below 2 degrees. And so this is the destination. This is what we need to reach in the next 3 to 5 decades. And we also know from climate science that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is much safer, and it's the goal that we should be aiming for. Now, based on this context, what do we refer to as science-based targets? Basically, we are referring to corporate GHG emission reduction targets that are consistent with the level of ambition that, according to climate science, is needed to meet the goals agreed in the Paris Agreement. And so, in a way, it's a translation of the global goals we have adopted through the Paris Agreement into specific goals at the company level. And so this transition happens in 3 dimensions. The first one is, as I mentioned, to go from global goals to company-specific goals. The second one is to translate long-term goals that are basically framed as something that we need to reach in by mid-century or in the second half of the century towards a time frame that drives action and accountability in the short terms, and we're talking about 5 to 15 years. And finally, we are translating a target that is expressed at the temperature level, so to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees, to metrics that are easy and relevant for companies, depending on the nature of the company. And so this exercise of translation is basically what we do with science-based targets, so that we have meaningful targets for companies that are consistent with the global goals adopted through the Paris Agreement. Now, science-based targets are consistent with this long-term vision of reaching net zero emissions by mid-century, but they are the stepping stones that help us get there, and they are consistent with this trajectory. In a way, science-based targets are equivalent to the NDCs that countries have, but these are, of course, applicable for businesses. Now, why are companies setting science-based targets? I think there are many reasons, and these keep becoming more and more obvious for companies. The first one is, of course, to anticipate and seize the opportunities behind the low carbon transition. In 3 decades from now, if we meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, basically every product and service delivered basically will have to be consistent with a net zero economy. And so that is a massive transformation of our economy, and there are multiple opportunities for companies in this transition. Also, to anticipate regulatory policy and market developments, we have more and more countries that have adopted ambitious climate policy. In many cases, they have committed to reach already net zero emissions for the territory, and in many cases, there's also this ambition being embedded, for instance, in trade legislation. And so, yeah, basically, as countries start to implement the Paris Agreement, this is going to become more and more embedded into our regulatory systems. There's also, of course, inherent competitiveness behind the low carbon transition, including minimizing energy and emission-related costs, and also seizing the opportunities behind the low carbon transition. And finally, and perhaps the one that is most important at this point, is to address expectations from stakeholders, including investors, customers, and civil society in general, about the fact that companies are good citizens and transitioning towards or adopting the goals adopted at the global level. All of these goals are reported by companies that are setting science-based targets. We conducted a survey a couple of years ago amongst the companies that are setting science-based targets, and all of them reported finding benefits that are basically related to what I just mentioned, including competitive advantage, increased brand reputation, opportunities for innovation, and also boosting confidence to investors. Now, there's also a lot of incentives and action that is happening basically by the dynamics of companies setting science-based targets. In some cases, we have sector-level collaboration that is emerging as part of companies starting their transition towards net zero. There's also, of course, peer pressure. We have more and more financial institutions and investors wanting to decarbonize their investment and lending portfolios, and basically, as part of that, engaging companies in their portfolios so that they decarbonize as well, and with that, they can fulfill their goals. And we have a large number of companies that are working with their suppliers so that they can decarbonize their Scope 3 emissions. Over 90% of the targets approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative have Scope 3 component, and as part of that, we have more than 50 companies that are explicitly asking their suppliers to set science-based targets, and so it is becoming an important expectation from multiple stakeholders. Now, Pratima mentioned this campaign that CDP launched last week that is basically mobilizing over 1,800 asking over 1,800 companies to set science-based targets. This is a request that comes from some of the largest investors and asset managers, and yeah, they see it as an important way to ensure the sustainability of their investments, but also to be able to play the role also in the transition towards a net zero economy. Now, finally, I would like to give you an overview about the Science Based Targets Initiative. The Science Based Targets Initiative is a collaboration between 4 organizations, CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF, and we work in collaboration with the Women Business Coalition and with a large set of stakeholders that are helping us drive corporate climate ambition. Our goal is to make science-based target setting a common practice in the corporate sector. And in order to do that, we work across 4 different dimensions. The first dimension is to build technical foundations to develop resources, tools, and guidance that help companies set climate targets that are consistent with our global goals. The second one is we drive the option of targets that are consistent with this transformation. We provide independent assessment on corporate targets to assess if they are consistent with the ambition required to meet the Paris goals. And we work through different mechanisms to mainstream and to accelerate the adoption of science-based targets. As Pratima mentioned, we have reached already over 1,000 companies with science-based targets in the pipeline. These companies are spread across over 60 different countries, and they're basically across the entire economy, every value chain. These companies already represent around 20% of the global GDP, and they have value chain emissions that are equivalent to the emissions of the US, which is the second largest country by emissions. Yeah, I'm not going to go into detail on this. Just one final slide, basically, to encourage you to join this journey. And the journey is very simple. Basically, companies need to start with understanding their carbon footprint and to engage in internal and external stakeholder collaboration to understand how the company can start the pathway towards net zero emissions, to get buy-in from the top and also from bottom up. Once companies are ready to set targets, they can submit the targets to validation to the Science Based Targets Initiative. And then once targets are set, companies, of course, announce their targets publicly. So we invite you to be part of this journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. We'll have quickly Rebecca just run us through the Science-Based Targets Initiative itself and what that entails.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Pratima, as well as for the invitation to speak today, and to all the large number of participants on the call. I will be covering a short overview of the business ambition for 1.5, as well as a overview of science-based target setting and the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Just trying to move to the next slide, if you just give me a moment. Great. So moving on for introduction on the business ambition for 1.5. So this is an urgent call to action for companies to set emission reduction targets in line with ambitious climate science, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. It is backed by a global coalition of UN leaders, business organizations, and NGOs uniting behind one message: that we urgently need to step up and tackle ambition for the best chance of limiting greenhouse gas emissions. So the campaign is led by the Science Based Targets Initiative in collaboration and in partnership with the We Mean Business Coalition, as well as the United Nations Global Compact. So to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to have collective action to move behind the latest climate science and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And the report released by the IPCC on 1.5 showed that 0.5 degree, so 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees, that 0.5 degree makes a world of difference. So hundreds of companies have already responded to this call to action and signed the Ambition for 1.5 commitment. And this is under the understanding that the transformation to the zero carbon economy is both achievable and has already begun. As of this month, 309 companies have joined and signed the Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees. These companies cover a market capitalization of $3.6 trillion, and within the Asian region, 42 companies have joined the Business Ambition for 1.5. This momentum shows that it is possible to fully decarbonize our economy by 2050 or sooner if we fully harness the support. Companies in high-impact sectors such as cement and chemicals are setting targets across their operations and value chains with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Governments should take confidence from the groundswell of business action. So taking a deeper dive and an overview into how companies can join the Business Ambition for 1.5, over the next 3 slides, I will detail 3 different options for joining and signing up. So the mechanism to sign the Business Ambition for 1.5 offers 3 options. And firstly, it's important to note that by signing the Business Ambition for 1.5, companies are committing to the Science Based Targets Initiative and to follow the Science Based Targets Initiative or SBTi criteria and recommendations, and to submit targets for validation. The first option is to set science-based targets across all relevant scopes in line with a 1.5 degrees emission scenario within 24 months. So to have a 1.5 degree aligned target within your direct operations as well as within your value chain. So this option assures the strongest ambition and action within the short to medium term and enables companies to align with the trajectories that lead to net zero value chain emissions by 2050. The second option that companies can join to is to reach net zero value chain emissions by no later than 2050. With that, setting science-based targets across their relevant scopes that is in line with our criteria. This allows a well below 2 or 1.5 degree targets in the short to medium term. So this option allows the strongest ambition in the long term and enables and introduces a degree of flexibility in the short to medium term, understanding that steeper reductions may be required later on to reach net zero by mid-century. So these 2 options in the Business Ambition for 1.5 give flexibility to companies as well as recognize sectoral or technical differences and barriers. And also it's important to note that the third option is that companies can select both option 1 and option 2. And in this case, companies are committing to develop 5 to 15-year science-based targets aligned with 1.5 degree scenarios across all relevant scopes, as well as a net zero target well below 2050. So I would encourage the companies on the line to explore the ambition page on our website, which you can see on the screen, where you can access the business ambition for 1.5 commitment letter and come and join different business leaders taking action against the latest climate science. And there it would detail that once signing the letter, you will submit it to one of our email inboxes, commitments@sciencebasedtargets.org, to then be profiled among the business leaders. Moving on to a very quick overview of science-based targets as well as our call to action process. As Alberto mentioned in the last section, science-based targets are a key tool for the low carbon transition, and they are corporate greenhouse gas emission reductions, which basically in essence specifies how quickly and by how much companies need to reduce their emissions and to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. And with the graphic at the bottom, it's just a visual representation showing that our long-term goal is to reach net zero by 2050 or mid-century. And then together with this requires accountability and action in the short to medium term by setting 5 to 15-year emission reduction targets. And then together with this to promote transparency and that there is action in the short to medium term annual disclosure of companies' corporate emission inventories. Great. So an overview of our call to action process, which is our 4-step process for companies to join the Science Based Targets Initiative. There's committing, developing a target, submitting a target for validation, and then announcing the target. And this is detailed in more information on our step-by-step guide on our website with the link included on the slide. Zooming into the first point on committing, this is a voluntary commitment that we encourage companies to partake by signing a standard commitment letter committing that your company will set science-based targets within the next 2 years. And further to the section that I discussed previously, we encourage companies to commit to the highest ambition by signing the business ambition for 1.5 commitment letter. And also it's important to note that as of mid-July this year, we've introduced a mandatory route for small to medium enterprises. So those are non-subsidiary companies under 500 employees, that there is an automatic commitment process through a target setting process that is specific for SMEs that offers 2 predefined options for setting targets, as well as a streamlined process to go internally that's easier for smaller businesses, as well as still promoting ambitious corporate action. The second step around developing a target is the meat of the work and the time that companies undergo. So aligning your company's inventory, collecting data around your direct emissions, as well as your value chain. and then exploring the myriad of resources that we have available, both from a technical standpoint as well as from a process standpoint, to then align your submission to our criteria and best practice. The third step is submitting your target for validation. So once the target has been developed and you've voluntarily committed, if interested, then companies can submit your target for validation. It's also important to note that companies can have an entry point around step 3, as the commitment is voluntary. And we've introduced a paid target validation service, which is a professional 30 business day turnaround in which technical experts from the Science Based Targets Initiative review and assess whether your corporate emission reduction targets are in line with our criteria and what is needed in terms of climate science. And then should your company be approved, we work with your company to announce on our Companies Taking Action page on our website, as well as our partners' website, and amplify the great work that your company is doing through our different channels. I'll pause here and hand over back to Pratima, but happy to engage further in the chat and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Rebecca. We'll now move on to our panel session, where we have Charlie Carnegie, who's the Research Director at RSA Partners, Damandeep Singh, who's the Director of CDP India, and Simon Ng, who's the Director of Policy and Research at the Business Environment Council, Hong Kong, join us today for this discussion. Thank you very much for being a part of this. Charlie, we'll start with you. RSA Partners has been investing in the consumer sector in emerging markets since 1996. And it's also one of the investors that joined the campaign in September asking companies to set science-based emissions reduction targets. Could you perhaps outline, how climate change is integrated within your investment decisions and how you engage with companies on their climate strategies?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Thanks very much for the introduction, and great to be here today supporting this important initiative. So I guess when we think about RSA Partners and our role in the world, we ultimately are intermediaries of financial capital, and we're representing a broad base of long-term minded institutional investors, primarily in the US and Europe, but also increasingly in Asia. And I think, again, if we think about their understanding of ESG, there's definitely a spectrum, but I would say that there's a huge increase, particularly interestingly in the last year or two, around ESG integration and how managers like us are doing this. So we don't get there's not one due diligence questionnaire that we receive now on behalf of our clients that doesn't include this as ESG as a topic. And then I'd say within this, the topic of ESG more broadly, climate change is the number one question that comes up. It is the one that the widest group of investors will kind of question us on. I'd even say that going one step further than that, there's a group of our clients included that have been setting their own net zero portfolio commitments. So they are aligning their portfolios with this long-term science-based target of net zero global emissions by 2050. And again, that's ramping up the need for us as asset managers and ultimately the end companies that we invest in to align with that if we want to keep hold of the capital in our flow. So I think there's a real clear demand for this from the client side, so the asset owner side, and that is only continuing to grow. So I think that's important sort of for context here, and it affects everyone in the chain. From our side, we have a slightly unique investment approach in that we invest. We model all of our companies on 20-year time horizons. We have this proprietary in-house financial modeling tool that looks at 20 years out, and we've done that for over a decade now. And importantly, what that does is it, pushes our horizon into a point in time where, these climate considerations become incredibly critical. So we cannot avoid, confronting these issues. And that has really important implications, again, for how we manage portfolios, how we allocate our capital. And then within that, we try and look at both the physical climate risk and the transition risk. So we're trying to, segment those separately. And again, the reason we do that is because you'll find when you look deep down that the companies are exposed to both quite uniquely. So there's not a kind of a common pattern necessarily between transition risk and physical climate risk. So we try and separate those two, and we dive into each of those to understand what exactly it is that what that risk level is. And I think importantly, again, it's not just about stopping the analysis at kind of a high-level risk assessment. I mean, again, linking back to kind of what the Science-Based Target Initiative is trying to deliver and signal here. We are trying to understand how each company is how they're exposed to the financial risks, but also how they're adapting their businesses to mitigate this risk. So, that balance ultimately between the risk exposure and their response is really where the investment decision making is made. So how we balance both of those two. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, a high level of why and how we think about this.
Thanks. We did a quick sort of polling, and I think some of the questions that are quite not really surprising, I guess. We'd asked, does your company, are they aware of climate risks within their business models? Are they able to identify low carbon opportunities? Or, more importantly, is the climate strategy that they've developed integrated within the enterprise risk management? And less than 25% have admitted it to being integrated within enterprise risk management. On the other side, we have you where you said, this is your strategy is mostly asset owner driven, where you have client-led demand for understanding the climate change implications on their investment portfolios, as well as that's what's driving them understand the implications of climate change within their own assets. Could you perhaps outline if whether there's an example on an industry or a company basis where you made a decision not to invest due to inherent climate change risks, or any company or sector where you decided to consider because you started seeing low carbon investment opportunities?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think that we've thought about this for a long time about kind of what does transition risk sort of mean in practice. And we can talk about the kind of technological risk, the policy risk, the market risk, the reputational risk, all these sort of risk factors. And we do think about those in each company, but what does it mean in practice? And we wrote a piece of research actually earlier this year. So as you mentioned at the beginning, we invest in the consumer sector, and traditionally that's been very, very skewed towards kind of staples businesses. So, FMCG companies, food and beverage. And we've looked for a long time at kind of where the risk, the transition risk sits within those companies. And one of the big conclusions that we kept drawing was that, we did have exposure to this dairy sector in emerging markets. And, the more analysis we did on it, the less comfortable we were getting with the long-term outlook. And again, this is a 20-year plus view. It's not a kind of 2 to 5 year view. It's a very long-term view. So we conducted some analysis around potential policy risk implications, and also thinking quite hard about this idea of market risk, i.e. how are consumers going to behave in 10, 20 years time as their awareness of this issue grows. And effectively, we took a hard look at the dairy sector and decided to divest of 2 dairy companies that we invested in that sector. And again, that was one of the primary drivers is that I'm sure a lot of the audience will be very familiar. There's very readily available alternatives to animal-based dairy, and they're growing in presence globally in the form of plant-based beverages. So we basically took the decision there that the ability to manage that risk is getting harder and harder, and the growth outlook for those companies is getting more and more challenging. And as a result, we decided to take our capital elsewhere because we could not build comfort in that longer term outlook. So that's the way that we approach that sector, for example. And again, I'd be happy to share. If anyone in the audience would like to see that white paper, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share that.
That would be great. We would be sending a recording of this webinar as well to the audience today. So if you feel that's relevant, we could share it along with today's webinar.
Sure.
Moving on to Simon. Simon, you wear many environmental hats, but one of your sort of groundbreaking efforts was really around your research and collaboration with the shipping industry to improve air quality. And this actually made Hong Kong the first city in Asia to regulate ship emissions to marine fuel. You've now taken on a new challenge at the Business Environment Council, where you're leading the efforts of the Low Carbon Charter. You've managed to have about 72 companies today that have joined this charter in an effort to set emissions reductions targets. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about why companies are joining this charter and the business case that you use for companies to set their science-based targets?
Well, first of all, thank you, Pratima, for having me here today. And I also want to say hello to the participants who are joining us online. Well, BEC is a non-profit organization. We are also a membership-based, corporate membership-based organization. So basically, we have roughly 200 members from the business sector. The reason why we are focusing on climate change and also, starting this idea of putting together a charter is in response to, the Paris Agreement and also to Hong Kong government's pledge to the business sector that, setting a carbon reduction target is the starting point to your decarbonization journey, and it's important for the city as a whole to move towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, having said that, as you asked the question, how are we going to convince companies to think along that line and to actually commit themselves to a long-term journey? I think this is critical. Now, I think the good news is actually compared to the past, say, 3 to 5 years, I spend less time convincing companies to join. Actually, we spend more time trying to support and facilitate that process. I think it means a lot to us and also to everyone on this panel, because companies, I think they are now getting a better understanding about climate change. They are ready to explore the challenges, especially the risks they are facing, including physical and transition risks. But at the same time, they also recognize the benefits and the opportunities arising from decarbonization. So instead of, putting or bringing along with me a deck of, reasons, actually some of the companies are approaching us, after knowing the charter and also other initiatives elsewhere around the world. Now, I think they are taking the initiatives to try to join some of the projects that would help them along that journey. So I think I'm not exactly answering your question, Pratima, but the reason is that, I think the business case is clear for everyone to see. And instead of dwelling on the business case, it's more important for us, especially based on my experience with the charter, to put together knowledge sharing opportunities, coaching, mentoring efforts to help these companies to achieve their aims. So that's my take in terms of where we are in the decarbonization journey.
That's great to hear, Simon. And I guess particularly interesting is the companies are not really questioning why do I need to join this. It's more a question of how do I and what is the support that I have to join this. And the science-based targets in many respects, and particularly the way you phrase it, it's a strategy roadmap, isn't it? It's a strategy development, which then also brings forth challenges. So perhaps you could outline some of the challenges that these companies have faced in developing SBTs and how your charter is helping them overcome these challenges.
Okay, thank you for the question. Now, I think I need to clarify first and for all Under the charter, we have two pathways for our signatories to choose. Pathway one is what we call an easier route. So basically, they're going to set targets that's aligned to direction or towards transitioning to the goals of the Paris Agreement. So basically, the signatories will decide the timeline, will decide their ambition level, and find a way to achieve those targets. But we have pathway two, which is exactly the science-based target, pathway. And with that, then basically they just follow, what Rebecca shared with us previously. You have to make the commitment, then you prepare your target, get the validation, and get it done. Now, for our signatories, 72 of them right now, I think the question that I received most of the time is it necessary for us to now jump to, science-based target, even if we are not ready? So in a way, they feel that science-based target is something more advanced, especially for the beginners who just, understand the journey and the need to, to mitigate climate change impact and to, build up their resilience. Our suggestion to them is maybe you can look up to, science-based target as your long-term goal. But even if you are not adopting science-based target methodology, you still need to understand climate science and the relationship with your decarbonization effort. And, building towards that, next step, you have to have a solid base. So, having your baseline sorted out and then setting your scope 1, scope 2 targets are as important as thinking about science-based target in the first place. So I think, for them, the message is, one step at a time. And I really feel that because we organize events for our signatories, and very often we ask them, what are the topics that you are most interested in? And even though most of our signatories haven't signed up for science-based target, they ask if they can get some knowledge about science-based target. I think it is a good demonstration about, their eagerness to understand what science-based target is, maybe as the next step in their decarbonization journey. So I think that's one challenge really to, ask them to keep an eye on SBT while at the same time convince them or encourage them to be a bit more realistic in the short term to do what they are capable of doing. Now, and if we look at it as a challenge, then our way to solve this challenge is, bring all the signatories closer together, encourage them to learn from one another, especially between the science-based target signatories together with the other signatories. Because, you always want to have someone to look up to, in your company. If you have someone next to you who are already very advanced in terms of their work, I think you will always get something from them, get some tips from them. And so, we try to put them together, not just for networking, but actually for co-learning. And I think that's a very helpful and powerful way to solve that problem and challenge.
Thanks for that, Simon. And, this sort of moves in very pertinent to what Daman is already doing in India. And, just to mention a little bit about Daman, he's been working on climate and environmental related issues for well over a decade now. And Daman, one of your success stories is really working with Indian companies on science-based targets. One of the little sort of little known facts, but highly interesting to me at least, is that after Japan, India has the most number of companies in Asia Pacific that have set and validated their science-based targets. For example, the first steel company in the world to have its science-based targets approved is from India. But I think what is also worth mentioning, and this touches very much upon what Simon just mentioned about co-learning and with companies that have already set science-based targets. The effort to set science-based targets in India, it was led by market participants. It was led by members in companies in the industry itself, as well as the incubator that Daman, you helped establish. Could you tell us a little bit about this and how companies were convinced to setting SBTs in India?
Thanks, Pratima. And, it really builds upon what Simon was saying and even before what Charlie was saying. And I think Alberto and Rebecca have laid the groundwork, and the idea was to make the concept very well known. When Science-Based Targets was first mooted at Paris, I thought, it's sort of a clumsy, inelegant kind of title, Science-Based Targets. I mean, sort of nerdy, that people don't understand. But now, because I think partly led by the political circumstances and the opposition from the world's sort of the most powerful country, it's become fashionable to talk about science-based targets. So we were aided by that. The second thing that came about was in 2018, there was a Global Climate Action Summit, which was in San Francisco again. And that was being promoted a lot by the California governor, and it was a UN organization. And just before that, earlier that year, Nigel Topping, who is now the champion of the COP26, was the CEO of Women Business, had met Anand Mahindra at Davos. Now, a lot can happen over cocktails, and apparently he was able to convince Anand Mahindra to. So at that time, there were only less than 300 companies that had signed up to science-based targets. So he actually convinced him, and we launched the Mahindra Challenge to take the sign-ups to 500 by the time of the Global Climate Action Summit. And also, that then gave the impetus, and there was a Mahindra Challenge that was launched, which is a global challenge in the name of an Indian company. So they got very excited, and partly they signed up because they also had a lot of business in California and in the US. So, they could write. So a lot of fortuitous circumstances came about. The fact is that, yes, they signed up, and, so they signed up. Okay, so Mahindra Group signs up to Science-Based Targets. They announced it. Now, Mahindra Group is actually nearly 100 companies if you see it, but their maximum emissions are concentrated in about 8 or 10 different companies. So one of the things was, okay, then when we got down to the brass tacks to look, the group as a whole, we don't want to sort of pack it by saying 100 companies have signed up. We want at least, 90% of the emissions on board. So we spoke to them. And then their CSO also was, how do we go about doing this? And people said, okay, the bosses said yes, but what do we do? So what Simon also mentioned, there is this need to talk and to coach and to mentor companies. So they came back to us saying, look, how are we going to do this? What do science-based targets mean? Does it mean 80% reduction? So people are nervous, right? What does it mean? So we could do a preliminary modeling of their emissions and say, look, in this sector, it looks like it'd probably be in the ballpark of 50%, 60%, that kind of thing. So that gave them confidence and succor, and then we worked with them to develop targets and so on. And by that time, they became experts to do that. So that then led us to believe, and we then were in discussions, and along with WWF, we spoke about setting up an incubator. And that means essentially what Simon was saying, to take companies, talk to them, and to mentor them and to handhold them through the journey. Look, this is what the targets are. This is what it means. At the first stage, at the ballpark, you're looking at 50 to 60% reduction. Then you're talking specifics. This is what your emissions are. This is what the modeling shows. This is the sectoral decarbonization methodology that can be applied. And this is what it's looking like. So most of the sustainability divisions are, despite the talk now, at least, the talk is happening. But when it comes down to their resource strap in terms of HR as well as money. So, and we set up this incubator. We were fortunate to get a grant to support that. So there is no financial implications for the company. So we are able to support that and to work with those.
Thanks for that, Daman. I guess, and just to the audience as well, because I see some of you have already inputted questions in the Q&A section. So do send in your questions. I can see that Alberto and his team are already responding and have responded to most of them, but we can take any additional Q&As at the end of the discussion. I have sort of one last question before we'll open up to Q&A, which is, Simon talked about how, it's important from a roadmap perspective that, there is a support system, and Daman, you just mentioned about it as well, that companies are able to learn. There's a peer-to-peer learning, which drives companies to set the ambition for science-based targets. What are the challenges in implementing these targets? And have you come across companies who have set these targets? It's initial days, I'm sure, but have you seen them meet any or hit any roadblocks with implementation? And how are they overcoming these challenges?
Very quickly, right now it's actually too early, and most of these companies are on this journey. So from the time they sign up to the time they set up the targets is actually 2 years. So a lot of them are in that phase right now, and they're working on those. And as Alberto has also mentioned in the chat, that their targets are reviewed every 5 years. So I think that will be down the road. And that's also actually an impediment to some of the high emitting sectors, and we're talking to those companies and to see how we can model and help them, is that there are a lot of the high emitting, and in fact some of the biggest emitting companies have the comfort and want to commit to the 2050 target, but what they're having difficulty is with the interim target, and also the technology uncertainty. How are they going to achieve those, given, the fact is that, hydrogen is going to be expensive, how expensive, CCUS. So all those discussions are ongoing. The fact is that, yes, 2 years ago, I was actually practically thrown out of the Ministry of Environment, saying that they don't want these programs in the country because, they don't want to be prescriptive. And last year, the Environment Minister actually quoted CDP and science-based targets in his address to the UN at the New York Assembly discussions. So there is a journey. They've learned and they see the importance of it. But the fact is that, yes, this is a slow burn exercise, and we need to keep sort of hammering at it and working with companies as well as policymakers to make that happen.
Thank you. I think I just want to, sorry, Simon, you were saying something.
Yeah, just very briefly, I concur with Daman, because there are so many uncertainties out there. It's really difficult to get all the information and be 100% sure. I mean, by applying this, then we'll get that result. I think the key really is no crime failing to achieve your targets. I think our key messages to signatories who fail to hit those targets is this is still a learning process. As long as you try to figure out why you fail to achieve that, and then trying to review and understand how you can do it better next time, I think that's good enough for me and probably for everyone. So the failure actually is a very important learning as well. And the better they share with the other signatories or other businesses, the better, because some companies might go down the same route and hit the same roadblock, and the sooner they know there's a better way to get around those challenges, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to sort of summarize this conversation very quickly, because I just see we've got about 3 or 4 questions. Majority have been answered, but there's still a few outstanding ones mainly directed to Alberto and team. But just to quickly summarize, I think what we hear sort of from Charlie, what we heard from you was there is a lot of investor demand and asset owner demand in really sort of pushing for a decarbonized investment portfolio. There are some, you highlighted some business cases on and investment cases on, some of the sectors that your organization is going to move away from, and because there are alternatives that are available and which make much more business case for them going forward. Simon, you highlighted on and Daman as well, it's not so much the case of companies at this point saying, why do we need to set science-based targets? The question is really, how do we set it? And what is the support system that's available to companies at a peer-to-peer level, but also understanding what are the challenges that could come with setting these targets and potential roadblocks and how to move forward. And so sort of having these incubators and the charter that Daman and Simon are very instrumental in putting together in their markets is likely the best way to getting companies to meet those ambitions that they are setting for themselves. Thank you very much for joining us today, and very, very much appreciate your participation. I'll just open up the questions now. I think we have one which is, I believe, Alberto or Rebecca. You might be better placed to answer. The question is, what are the related sector pathways available for SBTi for oil and gas service companies?
I'm happy to take that, Fatima. So right now we have a method that is in public consultation, actually. The consultation ends at the end of the month, and it's for integrated energy companies, which includes oil and gas and different parts of the oil and gas value chain. And the method is going to be a semi-citizen consultation, and it's going to be finalized over the remaining of this year.
Great. I think the second question that was asked was, are we able to set a target using the absolute contraction method?
I suspect that was a question related to aviation. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, I mean, all companies can use any of the methods that are available. Absolute contraction is available for all sectors. And then sector-specific pathways are available, of course, for those sectors where the development of those pathways is feasible based on what exists in climate scenarios. And yeah.
To add on to Alberto's answer, if it's in the context of aviation, just to flag that that sector is under development in conjunction with shipping and logistics to create a sector-specific methodology for those types of companies within that sector.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think one other question that we have is actually sort of, it's more cost related, but what support does the SBTi offer to companies in setting targets? And, is this usually done by third-party consultants, and whether we have a sense of the costs involved?
Well, I'm not sure who is this place, but I can say, I mean, in the SBTi, we don't provide direct support to companies, but this happens, for instance, as Aman mentioned, there are learning groups, or in the case of India, incubators, and in other countries, there's other type of activities that are being implemented to support companies. But the SBTi directly is not involved because we also validate the targets, and we need to remain independent from the target setting process.
Great, thank you. We'll probably, there are several other questions here. I think what we'll do is we'll probably, send answers to them separately, to the ones that have said it, just in the interest of time, because we're already 5 minutes over our scheduled time. I'll be asking sort of one question, which is, with respect to SBTi allows companies to meet net zero targets through 100% renewable energy. Are there any emphasis to ensure maximum energy efficiency is achieved in parallel to sourcing renewable energy?
Well, normally, if we have a sector-specific pathway that helps us assess the target, normally the pathway already involves a component in terms of energy intensity to make sure that basically there's the energy efficiency component involved, and then the decarbonization of the energy supply. And so these two are combined, and that's how scope emissions are calculated. Now, that's not possible in all cases, and in other cases, basically, we have to rely on scope emissions only because we don't have information in terms of energy intensity.
Great. Thank you, Alberto. Unfortunately, there are several other questions, but what we will aim to do is perhaps answer them and send them across with the recording, as well as RSA's investment decision on dairy and the beverage industry, and we'll get back to you on that. But we will conclude the session now, since we are unfortunately running out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today, and please do keep on the lookout for the remaining sessions in this webinar series. The next one will be hosted by the World Resources Institute, identifying the technical aspects that should be taken into consideration for setting science-based targets. Thank you.